The coffee shop buzzed with the usual hum of morning conversations, the hiss of steaming milk, and the clatter of cups being set on countertops. It was just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe provided a sharp contrast to the chilly air outside. He adjusted his jacket, shaking off the cold, and made his way to the counter. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, comforting in a way that made him feel, for just a moment, like this was a place where he could simply blend in. He had been coming here for months now, always the same order, always the same quiet routine. But today, something was different. The barista, a young woman with blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, stood behind the counter, her phone in one hand as she scrolled absent-mindedly. He cleared his throat softly, offering a polite smile. "Hey, good morning. Can I get a—" She didn't look up. Instead, her fingers tapped against the screen, her expression unreadable. A long pause stretched between them, thick with an uncomfortable silence. He glanced around, wondering if maybe she hadn't heard him. The cafe wasn't too busy. Just a few customers scattered at tables, deep in conversation or lost in their laptops. "Excuse me." He tried again, his voice still even, still patient. This time, she exhaled sharply, lowering her phone just enough to glance at him. Her eyes flickered with something. Annoyance, maybe. Frustration. It was hard to tell. Then, with a tone as cold as the wind outside, she muttered something under her breath. His stomach tensed. He wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. The words were sharp, cutting, and completely unexpected. For a second, he thought maybe he had imagined it. But the shift in the room told him otherwise. A few heads turned, subtle but noticeable. A man sitting near the counter looked up from his laptop. A woman stirring sugar into her coffee paused, her spoon hovering just above the rim. No one spoke, but the air felt different now, thicker, heavier. He felt his pulse quicken. His hands, once resting casually on the counter, curled slightly into his palms. He had dealt with moments like this before, those brief, uncomfortable encounters where a single word or look could change everything. But here, in a place he had come to so often. He studied her face, searching for some kind of explanation, some sign that he had misheard. But there was no apology in her eyes, no regret. If anything, she looked almost bored, as if she had already moved on, as if this moment wasn't even worth acknowledging. His mind raced. Did he confront her? Demand to speak to a manager? Or did he just walk away? Pretend this hadn't happened. Let it become yet another memory to push aside. The cafe remained silent, everyone pretending not to have noticed, yet no one daring to break the tension. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do next. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The hum of the coffee shop had dulled, the soft murmur of conversations, now a background static against the sharpness of what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, but outwardly, he forced himself to stay composed. He had been in situations like this before, ones that left a bad taste in his mouth, ones that stayed with him longer than they should have. But this one felt different. Maybe because it had happened in a place he had always felt comfortable in. Maybe because, for once, he wasn't sure if walking away was the right thing to do. The barista had already turned back to her phone, her fingers scrolling lazily over the screen, as if the moment had never happened. She didn't look at him again, didn't acknowledge the way the air in the room had shifted. It was as if he had become invisible in an instant, as if his presence had been dismissed entirely. And yet he could feel the weight of a few lingering gazes from around the cafe. Subtle, quick glances from people who had heard what she said, but weren't quite sure if they wanted to be involved. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "What did you just say?" His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it now, one he couldn't quite hold back. The barista finally looked up again, this time with an expression that was somewhere between mild annoyance and amusement. "Nothing," she said, her tone clipped, dismissive. "Do you want order or not?" He clenched his jaw, trying to decide how to respond. He could feel the heat rising inside him, a mix of anger and disbelief. He wasn't the kind of person to cause a scene, but he also wasn't the kind of person to just let something like this slide. He glanced around once more, catching the eyes of a man near the counter, someone who had definitely heard what was said, but was now pretending to be deeply engrossed in his laptop screen. "Actually," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "I'd like to speak to your manager." The barista rolled her eyes, letting out a short, sharp laugh. "Seriously?" She scoffed. "Over what?" "Because I didn't hear you the first time." A few more people had started to take notice now. Someone in line shifted uncomfortably. A woman at a nearby table stopped mid-sip, glancing between him and the barista as if trying to decide whether to step in. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice lower now, but firm. He refused to let her make him doubt what he had heard. The barista exhaled dramatically and turned to a door behind the counter, calling out, "Mark, can you come here?" A moment later, a man in his late 30s emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He had the tired look of someone who had been dealing with problems all morning and wasn't eager to deal with another. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between them. The barista leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "This guy is upset because I took too long to take his order," she said, her tone casual, as if the whole thing was barely worth addressing. His stomach twisted at the blatant dishonesty of it. He turned to the manager, refusing to let this be brushed aside. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice even. "I walked up, said good morning, and she ignored me. Then when I tried again, she muttered something under her breath." He hesitated for a brief second before repeating it. "She called me an ape." The moment the words left his mouth, the cafe seemed to shrink around him. It wasn't that people suddenly turned to stare, it was the opposite. Some customers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or coffee cups. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if hoping the situation would resolve itself before they had to decide whether or not to acknowledge it. The manager's face tightened. He turned to the barista. "Is that true?" She scoffed. "Oh my God," she said, throwing up her hands. "I didn't say that. He's making this into something it's not." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the manager's face. He looked between them as if weighing the situation, trying to determine the easiest way to diffuse it. The anger that had been simmering inside him was now threatening to boil over. He had seen this before, this hesitance, this unwillingness to take a clear stance. He had been in too many situations where people wanted to stay neutral, to avoid confrontation, to pretend they didn't know what was really happening. He took a deep breath. "There are people here who heard it," he said, glancing at the nearby customers. "If anyone wants to say something." For a moment, there was only silence. Then a young woman sitting near the counter cleared her throat. She looked nervous but determined as she spoke. I heard it," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She said it. A ripple of tension moved through the room. The barista's expression faltered for just a second before she quickly recovered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. The manager straightened his posture, his expression shifting. Now he could no longer brush it off. He looked at the barista, his tone sharper now. "Go to the back," he said firmly. "Now." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but she must have seen something in his face that told her it wasn't worth it. With an exaggerated sigh, she grabbed her phone and stormed off toward the back room. The tension in the air didn't immediately disappear. It lingered thick and unspoken. The manager turned back to him, rubbing his temples. "I'm really sorry about this," he said. "I'll handle it." He nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. It wasn't just about an apology. It was about how easily things like this happened. About how often people turned away, stayed silent, let moments like these go unnoticed. He turned to leave, but before he did, he caught the eye of the young woman who had spoken up. She gave him a small, knowing nod, and in that moment, he felt something shift. Maybe not everyone was willing to look the other way. As he stepped out of the cafe, the cool air hit his face, but it did little to calm the heat simmering inside him. His hands were still clenched into fists at his sides, his mind replaying the last few minutes over and over again. The way she had said it, the way the room had reacted, the way silence had almost won until that one voice, just one, had spoken up. He should have felt some kind of relief, knowing that at least one person hadn't ignored the truth. But all he felt was exhaustion. He walked down the sidewalk, his thoughts heavy. This wasn't new to him, not in the slightest. The only thing different was the setting, the faces, the way it unfolded. He had learned a long time ago that moments like these didn't just go away. They stayed with you, tucked in the back of your mind, resurfacing when you least expected them. He wondered if the manager would actually do anything, or if the barista would be back behind that counter tomorrow, acting as if nothing had happened. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a text from his sister, Maya. Asterisk, asterisk, everything good. You said you'd call earlier. Asterisk, asterisk, he exhaled slowly before typing back. Asterisk, asterisk, yeah, just had a long day. I'll call you in a bit. Asterisk, asterisk. He knew Maya would pick up on the fact that something was off. She always did, and she wouldn't let it slide either. He wasn't sure if he wanted to get into it with her right now, but at the same time, he didn't want to hold it in. Deciding he needed a moment to clear his head, he stopped at a park nearby and sat on one of the benches. The sky had started to darken, the streetlights flickering on, casting a soft glow over the sidewalk. People passed by, some in pairs, some alone, caught up in their own lives. He thought about the woman who had spoken up in the cafe. He didn't even know her name. But for some reason, her voice had cut through the noise, had shifted something. He wished more people were like that. More willing to stand in the uncomfortable spaces, to say something when it mattered. Because for every person who did, there were 10 more who turned the other way. He ran a hand over his face, trying to push away the frustration. He had work tomorrow, deadlines to meet, things to focus on. He couldn't let this take over his mind, but that was the problem. It always did. He wished he could just let it roll off his shoulders the way people told him to. Asterisk, asterisk, don't let it get to you. It's not worth it. Asterisk, asterisk, but how could it not be? How could something like this not matter? His phone buzzed again, and this time he saw Maya calling. He debated letting it ring, but he knew she'd just keep calling until he answered. Hey, he said, trying to sound normal. Don't hey me like everything's fine, Maya said immediately. What's up? He hesitated for a second before deciding there was no point in holding back. Something happened at the cafe today, he said, keeping his voice steady. One of the baristas, she said something messed up. The silence on the other end was short but heavy. What did she say? He told her, recounting every detail. The way the barista had brushed it off. The way the manager had hesitated. The way only one person had spoken up. Maya let out a sharp breath. "You okay?" He shrugged, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, just tired of it, you know." "I know," she said, her voice softer now. "I hate that this keeps happening. And I hate that people act like it's not a big deal." "Yeah." A beat of silence passed before she spoke again. "Are you gonna do something about it?" He frowned. "Like what?" "File a complaint. Call corporate. Something." He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Maya. What's that really gonna do? The manager already handled it, sort of. And even if I do report it, who's to say anything actually happens?" She was quiet for a second. "So what? You just let it go." He sighed. "I don't know. Maybe." "I get it," she said after a moment. "I really do. But letting it go doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it doesn't mean it won't happen again. Not to you. Not to somebody else." He closed his eyes, leaning back against the bench. She was right. He knew she was right. But he was just so tired. They talked for a little while longer before hanging up, but her words stuck with him. He knew he had a choice to make: either let this moment pass, just another bad experience to add to the list, or take a step, no matter how small, to make sure it wasn't forgotten. The next morning, as he sat at his desk, sipping his coffee and staring at his computer screen, he found himself pulling up the cafe's website. He hesitated for just a second before clicking on the Contact Us page. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, with a deep breath, he started typing. "Got it. I'll craft the next part of your story with natural, engaging language while keeping the suspense high. Here we go." The air in the room grew heavier as the tension between them deepened. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the judge, his stern expression unreadable. The woman standing before him clenched her hands into fists, her knuckles turning white. She had been through so much already, and now, at this moment, everything hung in the balance. The decision about to be made would change her life forever. The prosecutor leaned forward, adjusting his tie, his voice steady yet filled with quiet intensity. "Your Honor, the facts of this case speak for themselves," he said, turning to glance at the audience behind him. "We have presented clear evidence." But before he could continue, the woman's attorney quickly stood up, cutting him off. "Your Honor, if I may," he interjected, his voice calm yet firm. He turned toward the judge, choosing his words carefully. "My client has been unfairly scrutinized from the very beginning. What we're seeing here is not justice. It's a predetermined outcome." The weight of his words lingered in the air, making some in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. The judge remained silent for a moment, flipping through the pages in front of him. The sound of paper rustling was the only thing breaking the thick silence. Then finally he looked up. His gaze met the woman's, and for the briefest second, she thought she saw something. Hesitation, perhaps. Or was it doubt? She swallowed hard, her throat dry. All she wanted was to be heard, to be understood, to have someone, anyone, see the truth. But the system had never worked in her favor before. Why would today be any different? Meanwhile, in the back of the courtroom, a quiet murmuring started. Spectators whispered among themselves, some exchanging skeptical glances, while others shook their heads in frustration. They had been following the case closely, and opinions were already formed. Some believed she had been wronged, while others were convinced justice was merely being served. Then, just when it seemed like the judge was about to speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly creaked open. Heads turned as a man in a dark suit hurried in, his expression unreadable. He moved quickly, making his way toward the prosecutor's table, whispering something in his ear. The prosecutor's eyes widened, and his entire posture stiffened. Whatever had just been said to him, it changed something. The defense attorney noticed the shift immediately. "Your Honor," he said again, his tone more urgent now. "Something isn't right here. My client deserves full transparency." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples, clearly aware of the growing tension in the room. "I understand the gravity of the situation," he said at last, his voice heavy. "But let's not lose sight of the law." At that moment, the woman felt her heart pound against her chest. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what had just happened. What had been whispered? What new piece of information had surfaced? And more importantly, how would it affect her? The prosecutor cleared his throat, hesitating for the first time since the trial had begun. His confidence wavered, even if only slightly. "Your Honor," he finally said, his voice quieter now, "I would like to request a brief recess." A collective murmur spread through the courtroom. A recess? Why now? What had changed in the past few seconds? The judge narrowed his eyes. He could sense the shift, too. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at the prosecutor. 15 minutes, he said sharply. No more. As the gavel struck, signaling the break, the tension in the room didn't ease. It only grew thicker. People started whispering louder, speculating, trying to piece together what was going on. The woman turned to her attorney, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does this mean?" she asked, her throat tight with anxiety. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know," he admitted, "but something just changed. And whatever it is, we need to be ready." She nodded, trying to steady her breathing, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. But deep down, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The woman sat motionless as her attorney flipped through his notes, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. The recess was almost over, but neither of them had any idea what had just unfolded. She could feel the stares of people in the courtroom, their quiet whispers filling the space like an invisible pressure weighing down on her shoulders. The prosecution had been so confident, so certain of their case, until that moment. Something had changed, and she needed to know what it was. As the judge re-entered the courtroom, the murmurs quickly died down. Everyone was waiting. The prosecutor stood slowly, clearing his throat. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by something more uncertain. He glanced at the man who had entered moments before the recess, as if seeking confirmation, then faced the judge. "Your Honor, new information has come to my attention," he said, his voice carefully measured. "I need to request a reconsideration of certain evidence presented earlier in this case." The woman's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? What evidence? The defense attorney straightened in his chair, exchanging a quick glance with his client before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution has had ample time to present their case. If they are now questioning their own evidence, we have a right to full disclosure immediately." The judge nodded. "Agreed. Proceed, Mr. Daniels." The prosecutor hesitated again. His hesitation alone was enough to send a wave of unease through the room. He reached for a file and held it up. "During our recess, a witness came forward with testimony that contradicts key statements made in this trial," he admitted. "This new testimony calls into question the validity of certain claims against the defendant." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few stunned exclamations filled the space. But the judge quickly struck his gavel, demanding silence. The woman felt her pulse quicken. Was this real? Had someone finally stepped forward to tell the truth? Her attorney leaned in, lowering his voice. This could be it. If they're doubting their own case, they might not have enough to move forward. But something still didn't sit right with her. If this was the truth, if there was evidence proving her innocence, why hadn't it come up before? Why now, at the very last second? Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as she forced herself to stay calm. The judge turned to the prosecution. "You are aware of the gravity of your statement?" he asked, his voice firm. "If this evidence undermines your argument, then we must reconsider the integrity of the case entirely." "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied. "But before we move forward, I request permission to call a new witness to the stand." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The woman's stomach twisted. Who was coming forward now? She turned toward the courtroom doors, half expecting a familiar face to walk through. But when the bailiff opened the door, a figure she had never seen before stepped inside. A woman in her early 50s, dressed in a simple navy blue suit, walked carefully toward the witness stand. Her expression was unreadable, her posture tense but controlled. The prosecutor's voice was quieter now. "State your name for the court, please." The woman sat down, adjusting the microphone in front of her. "Dr. Evelyn Carter," she answered. Dr. Carter. The name meant nothing to her, but something in the way the prosecutor addressed her suggested that she was important. The defense attorney frowned slightly, clearly just as confused. "And your connection to this case, Dr. Carter?" the judge asked. The doctor hesitated for only a second before answering. "I am a forensic analyst. I was tasked with reviewing a specific piece of evidence related to this case." The tension in the room thickened. Forensic analyst. That meant one thing: there was physical evidence that hadn't been accounted for. The woman's fingers tightened in her lap. The prosecutor nodded. "Dr. Carter, can you tell the court what you discovered?" The woman inhaled deeply before speaking. "Yes," she said slowly. "I reviewed the initial forensic report presented in this trial. However, upon further analysis, I discovered discrepancies in how the evidence was processed. Certain key findings were either misinterpreted or omitted entirely." The courtroom went completely still. The defense attorney leaned forward. "You're saying that the evidence used against my client was flawed?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "I am saying that there is reason to question its accuracy." For the first time since the trial had begun, the prosecutor looked genuinely unsettled. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the witness with sharp eyes. "And what exactly did you find?" Dr. Carter shifted, adjusting her papers. "One of the key pieces of forensic evidence, the report that placed the defendant at the scene, contained inconsistencies in the timestamps. When I re-examined the chain of custody, I found that the evidence had been handled by an unverified party before reaching the lab for testing. This raises serious concerns about whether the evidence was compromised." The woman's head spun. Compromised evidence, timestamps that didn't match. This was more than just a mistake. This was deliberate. The defense attorney seized the moment. "Your Honor, if the prosecution's evidence is unreliable, then we must reconsider this case in its entirety. My client has maintained her innocence from the start. Now we have proof that the evidence used against her is flawed, and possibly even tampered with." The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He knew what this meant. If their evidence was compromised, the case could collapse. The judge steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. He turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Daniels, do you have a response?" The prosecutor inhaled sharply, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, given the nature of this new information, the state requests additional time to review the findings before proceeding." The defense attorney was already shaking his head. "No, absolutely not. My client has waited long enough. If the prosecution cannot proceed with confidence in their evidence, then this case should not continue at all." The judge exhaled slowly, as if weighing his decision carefully. The courtroom was silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The woman's heartbeat pounded in her ears. This was it. This was the moment everything could change. But then, just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, the prosecutor suddenly stood. "Your Honor, before you make your decision, there's something else you need to know." The judge frowned. "Go on." The prosecutor turned, locking eyes with the woman for the first time. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. "There is another witness who has just come forward," he said carefully. "Someone who claims they have information that will change everything." The woman's breath hitched. Another witness. Who? She looked toward the doors, her entire body frozen in place. The bailiff stepped forward again, preparing to open them. The courtroom held its collective breath. And then the doors swung open. The person who stepped inside made her blood run cold. The moment the doors opened, time seemed to slow. The woman's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped inside, someone she had never expected to see again. The courtroom was dead silent as the man walked forward, his face unreadable, his posture stiff. Whispers rippled through the room, people leaning in to get a better look. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his voice steady but laced with tension. "State your name for the court." The man took a slow breath before speaking. "Daniel Carter." The woman's stomach twisted. Carter. The same last name as the forensic analyst who had just testified. The connection clicked in her mind like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Her attorney turned to her, his expression questioning, but she had no answers to give. She had no idea who this man was or why he was here. The prosecutor continued. "Mr. Carter, can you tell the court why you've come forward?" Daniel's eyes flickered toward the woman for a brief second before settling on the judge. "Because I can no longer stay silent," he said, his voice firm but carrying an edge of regret. "I have information about this case that was deliberately hidden." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge narrowed his eyes. Hidden by whom? Daniel swallowed, his jaw tightening. By the same people who wanted this case to go one way and one way only. The ones who manipulated the evidence, the ones who made sure the truth never came to light. The woman felt a chill run through her body. She had spent months trying to convince people that something about this case didn't add up, that the way everything had fallen into place so perfectly against her had been too convenient. And now this man was standing in front of a packed courtroom, confirming her worst fears. Her attorney wasted no time. "Are you saying that someone deliberately tampered with the evidence to frame my client?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The gasps were louder this time. The prosecutor looked tense, as if he had known something like this was coming, but had hoped it never would. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, I need specifics. Who was responsible for this tampering?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before he spoke the name. A name that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The lead detective on the case. The very man who had built the prosecution's argument, who had testified with unwavering certainty that the evidence pointed directly to the woman sitting at the defendant's table. Chaos erupted in the room. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to regain control, but it was clear that everything had shifted. The lead detective sat frozen, his face drained of color, his hands clenched into fists. The woman felt her entire body go numb. She had spent every moment of this trial wondering how and why she had ended up here, how the evidence had so conveniently pointed to her when she knew she had done nothing wrong. And now she had her answer. Her attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, with this testimony, it is clear that this case is built on falsified evidence. We demand an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The prosecutor was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He didn't even try to argue. He knew. They all knew. The judge exhaled heavily, looking between the prosecution and the defense, then finally turning to the woman. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. This court finds the case against the defendant to be compromised beyond repair. All charges are hereby dismissed. The woman barely heard the words over the roaring in her ears. The weight that had been crushing her chest for so long suddenly lifted, leaving her feeling weightless and unsteady. She turned to her attorney, searching his face for confirmation that this was real, that she wasn't dreaming. He nodded, offering her a small, relieved smile. But just as she thought it was over, just as she allowed herself to take her first full breath in what felt like forever, Daniel spoke again. "There's something else." The entire courtroom, already reeling from the revelation, went still. The judge frowned. "What do you mean, Mr. Carter?" Daniel hesitated, as if he wasn't sure whether he should say it. But then he turned to the woman, his expression serious. "You weren't just framed," he said quietly. "You were meant to disappear." Her pulse stopped. The room seemed to close in around her, the sounds of the courtroom fading into the background. "What?" her attorney asked sharply. "What are you saying?" Daniel's jaw clenched. The detective didn't just manipulate the evidence to convict her. He was covering up something much bigger. She was supposed to take the fall for something she had no part in. The woman couldn't breathe. It wasn't just about framing her for a crime. It was about erasing her completely. The judge's voice was firm. "Explain yourself, Mr. Carter." Daniel exhaled. The real crime, the real cover-up, is still out there. And the people responsible, they're not done yet. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The woman thought the nightmare was over, but now she realized it was only the beginning. The courtroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The woman sat frozen, trying to process Daniel's words. It wasn't just a wrongful conviction. It was something bigger, something darker. The people who had framed her hadn't just wanted to put her behind bars. They had wanted her gone. But why? What was it that she had unknowingly stumbled into? Her attorney recovered first. "Mr. Carter, if what you're saying is true, we need to get to the bottom of this immediately." The judge, still visibly shaken, nodded. "This court will not ignore such serious claims. I am ordering an immediate investigation into the conduct of the lead detective and all officers involved in this case." The detective in question remained silent, his jaw clenched. He didn't argue. He didn't try to deny it. That silence told the woman everything she needed to know. As the judge adjourned the court, the weight of what had just happened settled over her. The charges were dismissed. She was free. But instead of feeling relieved, she felt exposed. She had survived this trial, but now she knew there were still people out there who saw her as a threat. People who had gone to extreme lengths to silence her once and might try again. Daniel approached her cautiously. "I know you have questions," he said softly, "and I promise I'll give you answers. But not here. It's not safe." Her attorney, standing protectively beside her, eyed him warily. "Why should we trust you?" Daniel sighed. "Because I was part of it. Not directly, but I saw things I wasn't supposed to see. And when I tried to speak up, I was shut down. I had to choose between staying silent or risking everything. For too long, I made the wrong choice." He looked at the woman with sincerity. "I'm trying to make it right." She studied his face, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But all she saw was regret and exhaustion. He wasn't just here to help her. He was here to save himself, too. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Her attorney shielded her as best he could, but there was no escaping the reality. Her story was now national news. The woman who had been wrongly accused, the case that had fallen apart in dramatic fashion, the detective who was now under investigation. As she pushed through the crowd, one question lingered in her mind. What was the real crime they had been covering up? That night, she met Daniel in a quiet, hidden cafe far from the city. He wasted no time getting to the truth. There was an operation, he said, his voice low. Something off the books. The detective you just exposed, he was in deep. They needed a scapegoat, someone easy to frame, someone who wouldn't fight back. But you did. She felt a cold chill. What kind of operation? Daniel hesitated. Let's just say it involved people in power. And money. A lot of it. He leaned in. Your case wasn't random. You were targeted because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You saw something, or someone, you weren't supposed to. She racked her brain, trying to remember anything unusual from the weeks leading up to her arrest. And then it hit her. A late-night stop at a convenience store, where she had seen a man arguing in the back alley with someone in a police uniform. She hadn't thought much of it then, but what if that moment had changed everything? I think I know what I saw, she whispered. Daniel nodded. Then we have to be careful, because now that you know, they'll know too. She swallowed hard. She had spent so much time fighting for her freedom, but now a different battle was beginning. Over the next few months, as the corruption case unfolded, arrests were made. The lead detective was charged, and more names surfaced. Officials, officers, people who had abused their power for personal gain. The deeper the investigation went, the uglier it got. Through it all, the woman remained strong. She had lost so much: her job, her reputation, her sense of security. But she had gained something else. The truth. And with it, a chance to rebuild. 1 year later, she stood outside that same courthouse, this time as a witness, not a defendant. She had been asked to testify in the trial against the very people who had tried to destroy her. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and walked inside. She was no longer just a survivor of injustice. She was a fighter, and she wasn't afraid anymore.